Okay, so we got Christmas Eve story here. As we approached the house, we heard the sound of music and now then a burst of laughter from one end of the building. This Bracebridge said must proceed from the servants' hall, where a great deal of revelry was permitted, and even encouraged by the squire throughout the 12 days of Christmas, provided everything was done comfortably to an ancient usage. Here were kept up the old games of the hoodman blind, shoe the wild mare, hot cockles, steal the white loaf, bob the apple, and snapdragon. The Yule log and Christmas candle were regularly burnt, and the mistletoe, while its white berries hung up by its peril of all the pretty housemaids. So intent were the servants upon their sports that we had to ring repeatedly before we could make ourselves heard. On our arrival being announced, the squire came out to receive us, accompanied by his two other sons, one young officer in the army, home on leave of absence. The other was an Oxonian, just from the university. The squire was a fine, healthy-looking old gentleman, with silver hair curling lightly around the open florid countenance, in which a physiognomist, with the advantage, like myself, of a previous hint or two, might discover a singular mixture of whim and benevolence. The family meeting was warm and affectionate. As the evening was far advanced, the squire would not permit us to change our travelling dresses, but ushered us at once to the company which was assembling in the large, old-fashioned hall. It was composed of different branches of numerous family connection, where there were usual proportion of old uncles and aunts, comfortably married dames, superannuated spinsters, blooming country cousins, half-fledged striplings, and bright-eyed boarding-school hoydens. They were variously occupied. Some at a round table of cards, others conversing around the fireplace at one end of the hall, was a group of young folks, some nearly grown up, others more tender and budding age, fully engrossed by a merry game and profusion of wooden horses, penny trumpets, and tattered dolls about the floor, showered traces of a troop of little fairies beings who have frolicked through a happy day, had been carried off to a slumber through a peaceful night. While the mutual greetings were going on between the Bracebridge and the relatives, I had spent the time to scan the apartment. I have called it a hall, for so it was certainly been in old times, and the squire had evidently endeavoured to restore it to something of its primitive state. Over the heavy project fireplace was a suspended picture of a warrior in armour, standing by a white horse, and on the opposite wall hung a helmet, buckler, and lance. At one of the end of the enormous pair of antlers were inserted in the wall, with the branches serving as hooks, on to which suspended hats, whips, spurs, and in the corners of the apartment were fowling pieces, fishing rods, and other sporting implements. The furniture was cumbrous workmanship of the former days, though some articles of modern convenience had been added, and the oaken floors had been carpeted, so that the whole presented of an odd mixture of parlour and hall. The grate had been removed from the wide overwhelming fireplace to make way for a fire of wood, in the midst of which an enormous log, glowing and blazing, sending forth a vast volume of light and heat. This, I understood, was the Yule log, which the squire was particular in having brought in illuminated on Christmas Eve, according to ancient custom. It was really delightful to see the old squire seated in the hereditary elbow chair by a hospitable fireside of his ancestors, and looking around him like the son of System, beaming warmth and gladness to every heart. Even the very dog that lay stretched at his feet, as he lazily shifted his position and yawned, would have looked fondly up at the master's face, and wagged its tail against the floor, and stretched himself again to sleep, confident of kindness and protection. There's an emancipation from the heart of genuine hospitality which cannot be described, but is immediately felt, and puts the stranger at once at ease. I had not been seated by many minutes by the comfortable hearth of worthy cavalier before I found myself as much at home as if I had been one of the family. Supper was announced shortly thereafter our arrival. It was served up in a spacious oaken chamber, the panels of which shone with wax, and around which were several family portraits decorated with holly and ivy. Beside the accustomed lights, two great wax tapers, called Christmas candles, wreathed with greens, were placed on a highly polished buffet among the family plate. The table was abundantly spread with substantial fare, but the squire made his supper of frumenty, a dish made of wheat cakes boiled in milk with rich spices, being a standing dish in old times for Christmas Eve. I was happy to find my old friend Mince Pie in the retinue of the feast, and finding him to be perfectly orthodox, and what I need not be ashamed of my predilection, I greeted him with all the warmth wherewith we usually greet an old and very gentile acquaintance. The mirth of the company was greatly promoted by a humorous of eccentric personage, from whom Mr. Bracebridge always addressed with the quaint appellation of Master Simon. He was a tight, brisk little man, with the air of an arrant old bachelor. His nose was shaped like a bill of a parrot, his face slightly pitted with a smallpox with a dry perpetual bloom on it, like a frostbitten leaf in the autumn. He had an eye of great quickness, of vivacity, with drollery and lurking waggery of his expression that was irresistible. He was evidently the wit of the family, dealing with very much in the sly jokes, innuendos with the ladies, and making infinite merriment by harpings upon old themes which unfortunately my ignorance of the family chronicles did not permit me to enjoy. It seemed to his great delight during supper to keep a young girl next to him in continual agony of stifled laughter, in spite of her awe of reproving looks of her mother, who sat opposite. Indeed, he was the idol of the younger part of the company, who laughed at everything he did or said, and at every turn of his countenance. I could not wonder at it, for he must have been the miracle of accomplishment in their eyes. He could imitate Punch and Judy, make an old woman of his hand, and with the assistance of a burnt cork and pocket handkerchief, and cut out an orange in such ludicrous caricature that the young folks were ready to die with laughter. I was let briefly into the history by Frank Bracebridge. He was an old bachelor of the small independent income, which, by careful management, was sufficient for all of his wants. He revolved through the family system like a vagrant comet in the orbit, sometimes visiting with one branch, and sometimes quite remote, as in often case with the gentlemen of extensive connection and small fortunes in England. He had a chirping, buoyant disposition, always enjoying the present moment, and his frequent change of scene and company prevented his acquiring these rusty unaccommodation habits with which the old bachelors are so uncharitably charged, and he was a complete family chronicle, being versed in the genealogy, history, and intermarriages of this whole house of Bracebridge, which made him a great favorite with the old folks. He was the beau of the elder ladies and superannuated spinsters, among whom he habitually considered a rather young fellow, and he was the master of revels among the children, so that there was more than popular being in the sphere in which he moved. Mr. Simon Bracebridge, of late years, he had resided almost entirely with the squire, to whom he had become a factotum, and whom he particularly delighted by jumping with his humour in respect to the old times, and by having a scrap of an old song to suit every occasion. We presently had a specimen of the last mentioned talent, for no sooner was supper removed, and spiced wines and other beverages peculiar to the season introduced, the Master Simon was called on for a good old Christmas song. He bethought himself for a moment, and then, with a sparkle in the eye, and a voice that was by no means bad, except that he ran occasionally like a falsetto, like the notes of the split reed, he quavered forth a quaint old ditty. Now Christmas is come, let us beat the drum, and call all our neighbours together. And when they appear, let us make them such cheer, as we keep them out of the wind and weather, etc. The supper had disposed every one to gaiety, and an old harper was summoned for the servants' hall, where he had been strumming all evening, and to the appearance of comforting himself with some of the old squire's home brewed. He was a kind of hanger-on. I was told of the establishment, and thought ostensibly that a residence of the village was oftener to be found in the squire's kitchen than his own home, the old gentleman being fond of the sound of the, quote, harp in the hall, end quote. My throat's getting very dry, so pardon me for taking water breaks. Okay. The dance, like most dances after supper, was a merry one. Some of the older folks joined in, but the squire himself figured down several couples with a partner with whom he affirmed he had danced at every Christmas for nearly half a century. Master Simon, who seemed to be a kind of connecting link between the old times and the new, and to be withal a little antiquated in the taste of his accomplishments, evidently piqued himself on dancing, and was endeavouring to gain a credit by the heel and toe rigadoon and other graces of the ancient school, but he had unluckily assorted himself with a little romping girl from boarding school who, by her wild vivacity, kept him continually on the stretch, and defeated all his sober attempts at elegance. Such are the ill-assorted matches to which antique gentlemen are unfortunately prone. The old Oxonian, on the contrary, had led out one of his maiden aunts, on whom the rogue played 1,000 little carnarvies with impunity. He was full of practical jokes, and his delight was to tease his aunts and cousins, yet, like all madcap youngsters, he was a universal favourite among the women. The most interesting couple in the dance was the young officer and a ward of squires, a beautiful blushing girl of 17. From several shy glances which I had noticed in the course of the evening, I suspected that there was a little kindness growing up between them, and indeed the young soldier was just the hero to captivate the romantic girl. He was tall, slender, and handsome, just like most young British officers of late years, and had picked up various small accomplishments of the continent. He would talk French and Italian, draw landscapes, sing very tolerably, dance divinely, but above all he had been wounded at the Waterloo. What a girl of 17, well read in poetry and romance, could resist such a miner of chivalry and perfection? The moment in the dance was over, and he caught up a guitar, and lolling against the old marble fireplace, in an attitude which I am half inclined to suspect was studied, began a little French of the air of troubadour. The squire, however, exclaimed, having anything on Christmas Eve but good old English. The party now broke up, and for the night, the kind-hearted old custom of shaking hands as I passed through the hall on the way to the chamber, dying embers of the Yule log, still sent forth a dusky glow, and it had not been the season when, quote, no spirits dares to stir abroad, end quote, I should have been half tempted to steal my room at midnight, and peep whether the fairies might be on their revels about the hearth. My chamber was old, part of the mansion, and ponderous furniture of which might have been fabricated in the days of giants. The room was panelled with cornices of heavy carved work, in which the flowers and grotesque faces were strangely intermingled, and a row of black-looking portraits stared mournfully at the walls. The bed of a rich through the damask, with a lofty testern, stood in a niche opposite of the bow window. I had scarcely got into bed, when a strain of music seemed to break forth in the air, and below the window I listened and found it proceeded from a band which I concluded to be the waits from some neighbouring village. They went round playing under windows, and I drew aside the curtains to hear them more distinctly. The moonbeams fell through the upper part of the easement, partially lighting up the antiquated apartment. The sounds, as they receded, became more soft and aerial, and seemed to accord with the quiet moonlight. I listened and listened, and they became more and more tender and remote, and as they gradually died away, my head sank in the pillow, I fell asleep. This was from Washington Irving, the sketchbook. I will read the next page, which is Palms, and that sets us up for Fezziwig's ball and a tree trimming party for friends, which I think the tree trimming party, it might have some story there, but I thought it was more recipes. But anyway, let's do the Palms so we can finish this book up tonight anyway. We won't finish the whole book. No. But this is the next section anyway. Blessed are the joy makers. That's a quote from Nathaniel Parker Willis. Christmas is the most human and kindly of the seasons, as we fully penetrate the eradicated with the feeling of human brotherhood, which is the essential spirit of Christianity, as a month of June with sunshine and the balmy breath of the roses. George William Curtis. The very society of joy redoubles it, so that while it lights upon thy friend, it rebounds upon myself, and the brighter his candle burns, the more easily will it light mine. Robert South. And we start with Fezziwig's Ball the next time on this book, so we are very close with getting done with this little Christmas a Time for Friends book. Thank you for joining me. God bless, and have a wonderful tomorrow.